in order to try to improve the world, right? There's applied implications to this. So just like we saw that social psychologists study stereotyping and prejudice in part in order to reduce stereotyping and prejudice in the real world, we're also going to see that for aggression. That they studied aggression, they have studied aggression for many, many decades because the ultimate goal they might have is to reduce instances of aggression in the real world. So we'll just keep that in mind. Also, if you remember at the beginning of the semester, when we were talking about research methodology, we talked about operational definitions and the importance of operational definitions. So just to remind you, this is when we're studying some sort of ambiguous concept. And in order to make sure we're all on the same page as to what we're talking about when we're talking about that concept, we come up with an operational definition. We define a concept in terms of concrete behaviors. And that is certainly true when we look at aggression. And the reason for this is because your definition of aggression might differ from my personal definition of aggression, right? And so if I do research on aggression, I need to make sure that you understand what I mean when I talk about aggression. So to make sure we're all on the same page, social psychologists have certain operational definitions that they use for concepts like aggression. And that's what I want to show to you now. So here's a typical operational definition for aggression that social psychologists use. Any form of behavior directed toward the goal of harming or injuring another living being who is motivated to avoid such treatment. And as you're going to see, there are certain key components to this definition that are required for this definition for reasons that you'll see. But let me point out these four key components of this definition. First off, when we are talking about aggression in social psychology, we are specifically referring to behaviors. Now, what that means is that if you have an aggressive thought, if you think about punching someone, for instance, or you have an aggressive dream, we're not going to count that as actual instances of aggression. And the reason for this is because social psychologists, as I mentioned a minute ago, are concerned with reducing actual instances of physical, or I should say, actual instances of real aggression in the real world. And so if someone has an aggressive thought and no one's actually harmed by that, it doesn't really matter to us. We're really concerned with behaviors that actually harm other people, right? And so we're only going to focus ourselves on behaviors and not thoughts or dreams or something like that. Second key component of this definition is that it's goal-oriented, meaning the person who's committing the aggressive behavior is trying to harm someone else. So if, for instance, I am playing basketball and while I'm playing, I accidentally elbow someone, we're not going to count that as an instance of aggression because I didn't mean to do it. It wasn't goal. There was no goal to harm anyone else, right? And again, we're interested in reducing aggression in the real world that we can actually reduce, the purposeful instances of aggression. So that's why we're interested in only this goal-directed behavior to harm people. A third component of this definition is that this aggressive behavior is aimed at a living being. It could be a human, it could be an animal, but it has to be aimed at a living being. So for instance, if I'm by myself and I get really frustrated and I punch my wall, we're not going to count that as aggression. And the reason being because there's no living being that's actually being harmed by my behavior. Now, if I punch someone else's wall or I punched a wall in order to intimidate someone, so there is someone that's being harmed by that behavior, that would count as aggression. But if I'm just by myself and I just punch a wall, that's not going to count as aggression because there's no actual person or actual living being who is being harmed by that behavior. And finally, the fourth component of aggression is that the person that's being aggressed against, that's on the receiving end of that aggression, has to be motivated to avoid that treatment. In other words, they have to not want that behavior to have happened to them. Okay? It doesn't mean it doesn't mean that they're aware that the behavior is going to occur. So you can imagine in a war scenario, for instance, if you've got a sniper who shoots and kills someone, that person might have never have been aware that the sniper was there, right? But had they been aware, they would have been motivated to avoid that treatment. They don't want to have been shot. Okay? And the reason that this part is in the definition is because there are some instances, some examples where people want that aggression to have occurred to them. So for instance, I always think of the movie Fight Club, if you've seen that. And in that movie, at one point, Brad Pitt's character asks Edward Norton's character to punch him in the face. He wants to be punched in the face, in other words. And when he punches them in the face, that doesn't count as aggression because he wanted it to happen to him. And again, this is because we are interested in in instances of real world aggression where people are aggressed against it, where they don't want it to happen to them. That's the type of aggression we're interested in social psychology. Okay. So what that means is that if you're ever faced with a situation where it's unclear as to whether it counts as aggression or not, then what you do is you go through this checklist and you ask yourself, in this hypothetical situation, was it a behavior? Was there a goal to harm? Was it against a living being? Were they motivated to avoid it? If you answer yes to each of those components, then that's going to mean that we're going to call that aggression. If you answer no to any of those components, then it doesn't count as aggression. And so, just to make sure that we're all on the same page with this, what I'm going to do is give you examples, some of which are examples of aggression and some of which are not examples of aggression. And I want you to tell me if you think these are examples of aggression. And you're going to do so by comparing this example to those 4 components. Okay, so imagine this. So imagine a hitman kills an unfaithful husband for the unreasonably low price of $1,000. And the question is this an example of aggression or not, according to our operational definitions? I'll give you a second if you want to write in the chat what you think on this. I see pretty much everyone is saying yes. Okay. So, and the way that we answer this, of course, is we're going to go through our 4 components. So we're going to say, is this a behavior? Well, yeah, killing someone is a behavior. Is there a goal to harm? Well, yeah, the hitman's trying to harm someone else. Is it against a living being? Well, yeah, the husband is a living being. Is that husband motivated to avoid that treatment? Yeah, presumably the husband doesn't want to be killed, so that would work. Okay. And so, because you answered yes to each of those 4 components, we're going to say yes, this is aggression. A jealous man kills his wife and lover. Is that aggression or not aggression? I see lots of yeses again. Okay, I think it's another relatively obvious one. So is it a behavior? Yeah, killing his wife and lover, that's a behavior. Is there a goal to harm them? Yep, he tried to kill them, sure. Is it against a living being? Yep, they're living beings. Are those living beings motivated to avoid that treatment? Yeah, they don't want to be killed. So that would count as aggression as well. Okay, so those are relatively straightforward. Now, as we're going to see, there is a difference between these 2 examples. The motivation for killing is a little bit different. They're both, in both cases, the hitman and the jealous man are both trying to kill someone, but their motivation's a little different. In the first case, they're only killing in order to get something else, in order to get money. In the second case, they're killing them because they're angry at them. And we're going to see that those are 2 different types of aggression later on, but in just a few minutes, but they both do count as examples of aggression. All right, let's look at number 3. Okay, I'm getting a message. Are you guys able to see my screen right now? Everyone can see the whole screen? Okay. All right, it looks like there might just be one student having an issue then. All right, let's look at example number 3. A prison ward executes a criminal. Does that count as aggression or not? So it gives someone the death penalty. Does that count as aggression or not? Okay, I'm seeing lots of no's this time. Oh, I got 1 yes. Okay, well, let's go through our operational definition, right? All right, so imagine that by executing, let's say you put him in the electric chair or lethal injection or whatever. Okay, so is that a behavior? Yeah, that's a behavior, right? Is there a motivation or a goal to harm the criminal? Well, yeah, they're trying to kill him, so yeah, that's motivation to harm them. Is the criminal a living being? Well, yeah, that's a human. Is that living being motivated to avoid that treatment? In other words, do they want to die? Probably not. There are some rare circumstances where they might want to be executed, but for the most part, they're probably not. So they are motivated to avoid that treatment. Because you answered yes to each of those 4 components, that forces you to say, yes, this is an example of aggression. Okay. So this is why we use operational definitions, because what you can see is that a lot of people's intuition as to what counts as aggression doesn't necessarily match up, right? So this would count as an example of aggression. Let's look at another one. A depressed person commits suicide. Does that count as an act of aggression? Got a no here. I've got mostly no's, one yes here. Okay. Well, again, let's go through our 4 components. Is it a behavior to commit suicide? Yep. Is there a goal to harm? Yep. Killing yourself, there's a goal to harm yourself. Is it against a living being? Yep. It's against the person who's committing suicide. Is that person motivated to avoid it? No, they're not motivated to avoid it. They're trying to impose that aggression on themselves. Because you answer no to that last component, that means this does not count as aggression. A man mentally rehearses a murder, aggression or not? Okay, I got some no's, I got some yeses. Okay, well, go through our 4 components. Is it a behavior? No, it's not a behavior right off the bat, right? Mentally rehearsing something in your head is not actually doing anything in the real world, right? So as long as you're only mentally rehearsing it, it does not count as aggression. Obviously, if you go through with it and actually commit murder, that is a behavior and that would count as aggression. But if it's only a thought and a mental rehearsal, it does not count as aggression. Yeah. There's a bunch of tricky examples of this. Yeah, because it's in his imagination. No one's actually being harmed, right? If you're mentally rehearsing a murder, no one has been harmed just by that. So there's no action. So it's not going to be aggression. A hunter kills an animal for a trophy. Is that aggression or not? And I got a bunch of yeses. Okay. Well, let's see. Is it a behavior? Yeah, killing an animal is a behavior. Is there a motivation to harm? Yeah, the hunter's trying to kill the animal. Is it against a living being? An animal counts as a living being. Is that animal motivated to avoid it? Now, obviously, they don't know they're being hunted necessarily, but they don't want to be killed. They would try to avoid it if they knew so, if they knew that. So you would answer yes to that. You answer yes to every component. That counts as aggression. A Girl Scout tries to help an elderly woman cross the street but trips her by accident. Aggression or not aggression? No, and I get lots of no's here. Okay, so why not? Let's see. Is it a behavior? Yep. Is there a goal to harm? No, obviously not. If the Girl Scout trips an elderly woman by accident, there's no goal to harm, therefore it does not count as aggression. A person punches a hole in the wall in anger. So I gave you this example a minute ago, right? So for the most part, this will be no, but there are some exceptions. So let's see. Why is this not count as aggression? Well, I assume you guys know because I mentioned it a minute ago. It's not against a living being, right? If you just punch a hole in the wall in anger, there's no one that's actually being harmed, and therefore it doesn't count as aggression. The exceptions to this would be if you punched a hole in the wall in order to scare someone, that would count as aggression because now you're attempting to scare them emotionally, right? So there is a living being who's being harmed there. But for the most part, if it's just because when you're by yourself and you're not trying to scare anyone else, then it would not count as aggression. One person calls another a racial slur. Okay, so mostly yeses here. So let's see. Well, is it a behavior? Yeah, that's a behavior. Calling someone a name is a behavior. Is there a motivation to harm that person? Yeah, you're not trying to harm them physically, but you're trying to harm them emotionally or mentally. That still counts. There's nothing in the operational definition that says that aggression has to be physical in nature. That's a key here. And so if you're trying to harm them emotionally, that would still count. Is it against a living being? Yep, it's against a living being. Is that living being motivated to avoid it? Yeah, they don't want to be called that name. So yes, they're motivated to avoid it. So yes, it meets all 4 of those components, and therefore we're going to call it an act of aggression. Okay. So remember that operational definition doesn't say that the aggression has to be physical. As long as there's an attempt to harm someone in any way, emotionally, mentally, physically, whatever, that all counts. What's that? Right, 5, yeah, 5 does not count. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, if it's in your own head, it doesn't count as aggression. If you're trying to harm someone mentally, it does count as aggression. Right. Number 10, a person slams a door shut after an argument. Is that aggression or not? A bunch of mixed responses here. Technically, probably I didn't give you enough information to tell. That's probably why there's a bunch of different responses, right? Because if you look, first off, is it a behavior? Yep, slamming a door shut is behavior. Is there a motivation to harm? That's sort of unclear. It depends. If you just slammed a door shut because you were frustrated, then there's not a motivation to harm. If you're slamming a door shut in order to scare the other person, then there is a motivation to harm. So that's what this sort of all hinges on. So technically, in this situation, you need a bit more information to know if this is an act of aggression. It completely depends on your motivation for slamming that door shut. But if you are doing it to scare someone, it would be against a living being who's motivated to avoid it. So therefore, it would count as aggression. Number 11, Bob tries to shoot Rick, but misses and hits Tom instead. Is that aggression or not aggression? Well, Claudia, you got the right answer. The only one who got the right answer. This is actually a little tricky because there are two different acts and you've got to analyze each one separately. First off, we've got Bob trying to shoot Rick and missing. Okay, so first off, let's analyze that situation. So Bob tries to shoot Rick but misses. So is it a behavior? Yeah, shooting Rick is a behavior, right? Is there a motivation to harm? Well, yeah, he's trying to harm Rick. Is Rick a living being? Of course, Rick's a living being. Is Rick motivated to avoid it? Yeah, he's motivated to avoid it. Therefore, you answered yes to all 4 components. Bob's act against Rick is an act of aggression. He tried to harm him. Now, note that in our operational definition, there's nothing that says that the attempt to harm someone has to succeed, right? So even if you try to shoot Rick, maybe Rick doesn't even know you tried to shoot him, right? You could have tried to shoot him and missed, and Rick never knew you tried to shoot him to begin with. That would still count as an act of aggression because you attempted to harm him, right? But now if you analyze Bob's behavior against Tom, so Bob accidentally shoots Tom. Well, is that a behavior? Yes. Is there a goal to harm Tom? No, it was an accident, right? So it's not an act of aggression against Tom. So keep in mind that the outcome of the behavior doesn't matter, right? What matters is the attempt, the motivation to harm. So even though Bob doesn't actually harm Rick, it's an act of aggression against Rick because he tried to harm Rick. And even though Bob actually harmed Tom, it's not an act of aggression against Tom because he didn't mean to harm Tom. So it's yes to Rick and no to Tom. So yeah, because there's 2 different things that happen here, right? There's 2 different people that are affected by his behavior. So you have to analyze them separately. Without his motivation to harm, Bob wouldn't have tried shooting anyone. Yeah, that's true. But the point is the motivation was only against Rick and not against Tom. So the answer is yes and no. Okay. A couple other, I guess, distinctions I want to make that social psychologists make when they talk about aggression. One distinction is between what's known as hostile aggression and what's known as instrumental aggression. So hostile aggression is the aggression we engage in typically when we're mad at someone and we harm them, and the goal is to harm them, right? So the aggression is an end in and of itself. The point is the aggression. So you're mad at someone, you punch someone in the face because you want to hurt them. That's an example of hostile aggression. This is sometimes called hot aggression. When we use the word hot in social psychology, it usually means infused with emotion or motivation. And so in this case, hostile aggression typically is when someone's mad at someone, right? And they're trying to harm them. So that's why it's called hot aggression. In contrast to hostile aggression is what's known as instrumental aggression. Instrumental aggression occurs when someone uses aggression not for the aggression itself, but they're using aggression in order to get something else. So we talked about in the first couple of examples that on the last slide, the first example was a hitman kills someone for $1,000, right? Well, the hitman is killing this person not because they hate that person, because by killing them, they get money, right? There's some other reason why they're using aggression. In the second example I gave you, I said that a jealous man kills his wife and lover, right? Well, in that case, the aggression is the end in and of itself. He's trying to harm those people. And so that would be an example of hostile aggression. A hitman would be an example of instrumental aggression, using aggression for some other end. This is sometimes called cool or cold aggression, because in contrast to hostile aggression, which is sort of emotion filled, instrumental aggression is often sort of cold aggression, because if you think of the hitman doesn't hate this person that they're killing. They're just doing it for money. There's not really emotion involved with that act. Therefore, it's cold or cool aggression. Now, behaviors don't have to be one or the other. They could be both. So for instance, let's say you take like an American soldier who is held hostage. Let's say at wartime, they're taken as a prisoner of war and held hostage and killed, let's say. In that case, oftentimes let's say a terrorist is the one that captures this person. The terrorist kills the American soldier. Well, in that case, they might be killing the American soldier in order to get America to withdraw its troops from their country or something, right? So they're using aggression as a means to get something else. So that makes it instrumental. At the same time, if the terrorist actually hates Americans, then there's also a hostile aggression component of it as well, where they also want to inflict harm on the American soldier. So that behavior can be both hostile and instrumental at the same time. So like killing an animal, well, if you're hunting, then you're killing an animal, let's say for a trophy or for meat, if you're going to eat it later on, you're killing it for some other reason. That would be instrumental. If you kill an animal because you hate bunnies or something, that would be an example of hostile aggression, but hopefully people don't hate bunnies. Okay? Or if you take a look at, let's say, a boxing match, right? Usually in a boxing match, the aggression, and certainly boxing would count as aggression, it would meet all four components of our definition. That aggression usually would be instrumental because you're usually inflicting damage or trying to harm the other person in order to win the fight, right? So you're using aggression to do something else to win the fight. But if the two boxers truly do hate each other and truly want to inflict damage on the other person, it can also be an example of hostile aggression. Or if you are this kitten and you're hired to kill dogs, again, if you're being hired and paid for it, it's instrumental. But if, as a kitten, you hate these German Shepherds, it could also be hostile aggression as well. Okay, so that's one distinction that we draw in social psychology between hostile and instrumental aggression, in part because the ways of reducing hostile aggression are different than the ways of reducing instrumental aggression. You've got different strategies to do so. We also want to make a distinction between what's called physical aggression, which is the aggression we normally think of, right? That's hitting, punching, kicking, anything that's physical in nature. We often make a distinction between that sort of physical aggression and what's called relational aggression. Relational aggression occurs when you're not harming someone physically, but you're harming their relationships with other people. That could be like damaging their status or their reputation. So for instance, gossiping about someone else, spreading rumors, giving someone the silent treatment. All of these things count as aggression. They all meet that definition, right? So if, for instance, let's say in high school or something, and you gave someone a silent treatment because you were mad at them, well, that's a behavior. You've got a motivation to harm them, to make them feel bad. It's against a living being, and that person's motivated to avoid it, right? It meets all parts of that definition. So that counts as aggression. It's obviously not physical aggression. It's relational aggression. Okay, so relational aggression is particularly prevalent among like preteens and teenagers, like in grade school, junior high, high school, that sort of thing. Becomes less prevalent among older people, but still somewhat prevalent. Yeah, it can be kind of like a passive aggressive behavior to some extent. Okay. One question that not only psychologists, but philosophers and theologians and all sorts of people throughout the ages have had is the following. Is aggression a biological behavior or a learned behavior? In other words, are we born with a tendency to aggress, or do we learn how to aggress? And lots and lots of people have grappled with this question. And yeah, in general, in psychology, if you ask, is a behavior biological or learned, it's almost always both. Almost always. Not quite always, but almost always. And that's certainly true for aggression, as we're going to see. But the question here, and sometimes people have phrased this in terms of this, is whether humans are what are called noble savages. You can think of a savage, the way that they mean it in this phrase is a savage is someone who hasn't been exposed to culture or society, someone who grew up in a jungle, for instance. Okay. And so a noble savage would mean if you've grown up outside of society, outside of culture, noble is a good thing. It's being a good person, right? So a noble savage would imply that if you're not exposed to culture and society, if you don't learn it, then you're going to naturally tend to be good. Okay. So the perspective that humans are noble savages implies that perspective means that people think that aggression is something that is learned, but we're not inherently naturally aggressive. So the two different perspectives can be summed up the following way. So if you look at Jean-Jacques Rousseau, okay, back in 1755, he said the following. So many authors have hastily concluded that man is naturally cruel and requires a regular system of police to be reclaimed, whereas nothing can be more gentle than him in his primitive state, when placed by nature at an equal distance from the stupidity of brutes and the pernicious good sense of civilized man. Okay, kind of wordy here, but the main idea is this. Nothing can be more gentle than mankind, and obviously they don't mean man, they mean humankind, than humankind in his primitive state. So the idea that Jean-Jacques Rousseau has is that people are naturally gentle. And what happens is that society and culture makes us aggressive, teaches us how to be aggressive. Okay? But the idea here is that humans are noble savages, in other words. And so this sort of philosophy is captured in the idea of Tarzan, for instance. So Tarzan grows up in the jungle outside of human society, and Tarzan is what the gentle giant or whatever they call him. That he's naturally non-aggressive and sort of good, right? And so this is the idea that aggression is only a learned behavior, and so if you don't expose people to society and culture, then they're not going to tend to be aggressive. So that's certainly one perspective. The other perspective is captured by Thomas Hobbes, philosopher, in 1651, who said the following. Hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war. And such a war is as if of every man against every man. Okay. So the idea here is that without a common power to keep them in awe, they are in a condition called war, meaning people are naturally aggressive. They're naturally tending towards war at an inherent natural sense, unless they have a common power to keep them all in awe. That common power would be society, for instance. Okay? So if we're in a society that teaches us to restrain ourselves, then we can inhibit that aggressive urge, but naturally we are aggressive. That's a position that Thomas Hobbes takes. This is obviously the opposite position. And this sort of idea is captured in, for instance, the book The Lord of the Flies. I'm assuming some people probably have read that book in high school or something. It's often commonly assigned. In the book Lord of the Flies, it's basically a bunch of boys and their plane crashes on a deserted island. And there's no adults around. I think it's all like 10 or 11-year-old boys. And there's no adults around. And so basically, you've taken boys who've grown up in society, you now remove them from society. And what happens over the course of the book is the boys get more and more violent and aggressive over time as they sort of revert back to their natural inclinations. So the idea here is that humans are naturally aggressive and violent unless we're in a society that restrains those natural urges. So we're going to look at both of these perspectives. So the first thing we're going to do